It provides a cultural opportunity for students as well as the community to explore the rich heritage of St. Bernard and the New Orleans area. Greetings and welcome to the first lecture of the fourth season of the Nunez History Lecture Series. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces and to get back into the swing of things after a boring lecture-free summer. And just in case you're worried, before the season began, we organized and came to an agreement that there'd be no hurricanes within 3 days of any lecture. So you're safe for all the rest of them. We try to take care of everything here. We've had many changes over the summer. We've been hard at work, and so I wanted to outline just a few of the major ones. One of our missions is to preserve our local heritage, and so we're going to have each of the lectures professionally taped and made into DVDs and VHS tapes. We're going to distribute those to all the local libraries and schools, and I'll have some as well in case anybody misses a lecture. And we're in negotiations with Blockbuster to go national, and I'll let you know how that goes. So maybe we'll be able to have even a better reception if we can sell the rights or whatever. Also, another mission of the lecture series is to reach out to the entire community. And the time of the lectures is sometimes a little inconvenient for high school students. So we've arranged in conjunction with the St. Bernard Parish School Board to have three special daytime lectures. We're going to provide transportation, provide a good lunch, and of course an exciting lecture to bring the high school students over here. And we will, in addition to, of course, spreading the word about the History Lecture Series, we hope to form a few future historians in the process. So we'll see how that goes. Mr. Chris Fatzer, who's a local historian and expert on Old Arabi, will now give what I think is a fascinating lecture on the history of Old Arabi. Let's give him a hand.
Good evening, folks. Before I start speaking about Old Arabi, I'd like to just acknowledge some assistance that I've received for this program and over the years from the Old Arabi Neighborhood Association, from the St. Bernard Voice, and also from Historic New Orleans Collection. Start speaking about Old Arabi, you could speak of the area that we're going to speak about. We'll zero in on that area a little bit so we can be specific. Talking about the area from the Orleans Parish line, Jackson Barracks, through Old Arabi, Angela Mealy, Aycock, Friscoville, and then actually we're going to cover all through the sugar refinery all the way over to the Chalmette Slip and the history of that area. As a good bit of the history of this area is very similar to the history of Louisiana in the old days, in the early times, much of the area, all of the area was plantations. And this particular, a couple of things to understand. This would have been called with the Mississippi River going downstream toward the Gulf, this area would have been called in the old days with plantations, it would have been called the left descending bank, the east bank of the river. All of the, the pieces of land, which were the original plantations, would have been measured in arpents along the riverfront, an arpent being American measure about 192 feet by a standard depth back to around Florida Avenue of 40 arpents deep. Some of them actually had a deeper depth of what they call double concession, would have went back to 80 arpents. So one of the early plantations in what's today Old Arabi, particularly from the area like Friscoville Avenue down, was a plantation which was owned by a gentleman who was, a French colonial governor of Louisiana in like the 1740s. His name was the Marquis Vaudreuil. And he had an indigo plantation, a large indigo plantation. And I guess it was about, if you do the calculations, it was about 300 acres. And he was also one of the, one of the originators of Mardi Gras balls and tableaux in New Orleans. And so from his plantation, which was growing indigo, which wasn't necessarily real successful. You know, indigo was a plant that the early colonial French wanted to use to make a valuable dye. And that faded out. That gave way to sugarcane, which was never really big in this vicinity because the pieces of land were really kind of small. It gave way to brickyards, being the main function of these plantations, which I'll talk to you about a little bit later on. I guess I want to go back to the date of the era of the Louisiana Purchase, you know, 1803. By 1805, the boundary line was set between Orleans and St. Bernard parishes, and the parishes were starting to get in place. The original boundary line between St. Bernard and Orleans would have been what's no longer, there's no longer any trace of it in this area. It would have been called, as a waterway called Fisherman's Canal. It was a man-made waterway which connected in the back to Bayou Bienvenue. And it would have been somewhere in the vicinity of like Aycock, between Aycock and Hernandez Street, when it got along the river. And so that means that, as you can imagine, most of what's today Old Arabi, a good bit of it was originally Orleans Parish, and there was a reason I'll get to later why it was moved. But I guess the beginning of the plantation era that I'd like to start in would have been like in the 1820s. In the 1820s, we had an individual named Dr. William Flood. Dr. William Flood was an older, well-known physician who had participated in the Battle of New Orleans. His plantation pretty much stretched from what's today Flood Street in the 9th Ward all the way down to like the middle of Mealy Avenue. And he died in the 1820s. When he died, his plantation was subdivided into 18 lots, or 18 smaller plantations. And we'll talk about some of those that Old Arabi developed from. This is an aerial shot of Jackson Barracks from the 1930s. I'm just going to use it as an example, this being the Delry Street side over here. And then this showing some of the area which is now Old Arabi, this being the Angela Street here and the Angela Street side. This plantation, at least the eastern half of Jackson Barracks, was lot 16 of Dr. Flood's plantations. The eastern half, it belonged to a guy named Pierre Carteret, and he bought it like in the 1830s. He didn't own it very long. He held on to it for a couple years, and then the U.S. government bought from him this area all the way back 40 arpents to establish a military post here. And the main reason they put the military post here was to protect New Orleans from a slave revolt, because that was a very big danger at that time. He had an interesting wife that we'll talk about later. He was married a woman named Eugenie Treme. If y'all have heard of Faubourg Treme, which was around where the Municipal Auditorium is now in New Orleans, the person whose plantation that was, who developed that subdivision, Faubourg Treme, was Claude Treme. And St. Claude Avenue is actually named after Claude Treme. Well, this person, Eugenie Treme, was a very close relative of Claude's. And she was sort of like, I guess what we'd call today, a black widow type of an entity, because she actually married and outlived 3 neighbors who just happened to own 3 adjoining tracts of land, one of which was her brother-in-law, which I'll tell you about in a little while. So anyway, she was originally married to Pierre Carteret, who owned this tract, who sold to Jackson Barracks. The next tract going down, which would have been the tract which goes between what's today the Eastern Barracks wall and the middle of Angela, would have originally belonged to a person who bought it from this tract right here, who bought it from Dr. Flood's family. And that person's name was David Urquhart, like Urquhart Street in New Orleans. And in about 1833, David Urquhart built this shows how the tracts went together, U.S. Barracks and d'Aberval, which is a later name for the Urquhart tract, and then Lesseps, which is the tract between Mealy and Angela. This is an early act of sale, involving the property between Mealy and Angela and this lady, Eugenie Lesseps. But let's look at the house. This is the house which in later years was called the Miro House, well, the Momus House and the Miro House, or Chateau des Fleurs. This house was in what's today the 200 block of Angela. It was in between the middle of Angela and Jackson Barracks, that piece of land, and it was built in the 1830s by David Urquhart. He owned it for a little while, not very long. He had a daughter who was a famous actress, I think, on Broadway named Cora Urquhart. He eventually sold it to a guy named Alexander Lesseps. And Alexander Lesseps had some famous relatives. His first cousin was the Count de Lesseps, who built the Suez Canal in Egypt. And he was married first to Eugenie's sister, Treme, whose name was Manette, with an M, Treme. And he and Manette Treme had two daughters, one of which being Angela, whose the street is named after, Angela, who later married Emile d'Aberval, and a lady named Hercule with an H, Saulette. And what had happened was when their mother died, when Manette died, he married Manette's sister, who was a widow at that time, Eugenie, who had previously been married to the guy next door. The house lasted through, I guess in the 1870s, we can go back to a previous slide and I'll show you. This is from like 1878 when the family eventually started subdividing this area. Angela, and this would have been like the center line of Angela, this would have been like the center line of Mealy, which were the borderlines between these two pieces of land. What we have is Angela and her sister selling off lots in this area in the 1870s, and the very first square block off the river, right up in this area where the house was, would have been sold to Joseph Momus. Joseph Momus being, originally a local, very successful butcher, then later a banker, the founder of St. Bernard Bank and Trust. And they owned the house for a long time. He had two daughters, one named Anita Miro, who was the wife of Dr. L.A. Miro, our sheriff, and one named Bertha Clavery. And they lived in the house, and they probably gave the house the name Chateau des Fleurs. And this is some later pictures of the house when they lived in it, and Angela Avenue when they started to develop it with a long white picket fence along there. Still today in the 200 block of Angela, there's some individual's driveway where their side gate was. They have in the old ceramic New Orleans tile, like you'll see on the street corners, the name the name Momus. And the house eventually burned in, the house eventually burned in 1939. This is another picture, early picture of Angela Street. The house burned in 1939. Then they had a hurricane in 1947, which destroyed what was left of it. And then Anita Miro and Bertha Clavery took the square and divided it into 10 smaller lots where 10 houses were built. And so that is pretty much the story on that piece of property. Directly across the street, remember, this is Eugenie's full name here. Her name was Eugenie Treme Carteret Saint Marie Quarron, which is a last name, Lesseps. And her second husband was Francois Saint Marie Quarron. And this house originally stood across the street. This was the Plantation House on what was Dr. Flood's original Tract 18, which went from the present middle day of line of Angela Street to the middle line of present-day Mealy Street. She lived in this house. After her third husband, Angela's father, Alexander Lesseps, passed away, she later subdivided this house into, which is what we can see in this map back here, and also in the 1870s, into squares. These are all streets. This is the North Peters, this is Jumonville, which became Pontalba. This is Delaron, which became Bienvenue, this is Delaron, which became Douglas, and then this is, I think, is Charters. And she eventually had some Again, I don't know if it was because of loans or if it was some sort of a partition between some other heirs in the family, but she did some selling and buying back of some properties in this area from a Chute family that lived in Paris, and then she eventually sold them with the first square. This is the act of sale with the first square, and you see her name is when she sold it to Joseph Momus. This is the square that was bounded by Angela, North Peters, Mealy, and Pontalba, and you can see her whole name is recited up here at the top of the act of cash sale. So she lived in this house. When she passed away, I guess in the 1870s, this house was eventually converted into a house, which I'll show you later, the foundations were, which around the turn of the century was the residence of Judge Nemo Nunez, Ralph McDougall's grandfather. And that house stood, I guess, until the 1980s when it burned. And today, the house, which on the same location, today that site is the site of two more modern houses. This is an old picture, I guess, of Dr. Miro from around the time that he would have married Anita Momus. And then these are some folks that were important in the area of Angela and Mealy. This is, let's see, Fernando Estopanol, who was a local attorney, who built a very nice Edwardian-style house. It's now on Angela and Bienvenue that currently belongs to Darren Roy. This was Pierre Piat, who was a local a local realtor who lived on Mealy and sold a lot of houses on Mealy. And this is Raymond Lannis, who was, I guess, an attorney who was related to the Lannis family and the Ciotat family. And then this was a Leon Bouzeres, who was a butcher in the slaughterhouse, I think. This is Louis Reichert, who was involved in his brother, I guess, Jacob Reichert's rendering business. There's Henry Senac, who was a local realtor who sold a lot of early houses on Angela Street. Then we have, let's see, we have Charles Booz, who is, I guess, an ancestor of the present Booz family that lives on Angela, as well as a resident of the old Mocker family, which was one of Angela's oldest families. Pierre Esquet, who lived on Angela, who was I guess, the first president of our water board in St. Bernard when we actually got running water down here. Let's see, Fred Ahrens, who was a local attorney who I think lived on Friscoville. We'll talk about that later. Jean Sarignac, who was LeBeau and Sarignac, they were general contractors. They built a lot of houses in Old Arabi. These are some of the houses I'm speaking of. This is the house which was built on the foundations of St. Marie-Croix Plantation, which belonged to Judge Nunez around the turn of the century, which burned in the 1980s. This is the house which was originally built by Oliver Liverday. He only lived there for a couple years. And this is the house where Dr. Miro and Anita Momus were married and where they lived for a little while. And then this is Matt Reuter's house, who was an early president of the St. Bernard School Board and whose son lived there until his death recently. His son was the postmaster of Arabi. And I'll talk a little bit about the St. Bernard Voice. There was some old newspapers in St. Bernard which predated the St. Bernard Voice. There was a paper that was published for about 10 years from like 1877 to 88 named the St. Bernard Eagle, or the Weekly Eagle, published by a person named A.J. Padron, who was later the first Arabi postmaster. There was a later newspaper called The Progress, which was published from 1888 to 89 by a person named A.P. Boupe. And William F. Roy went to work for him as an apprentice, and then in January of 1890, William F. Roy established the St. Bernard Voice, which is still in existence today, with the old building looking a lot like it does today, or like it did in 2002. I'll talk in a little while later about this building. This is one of the oldest buildings in Arabi. It was moved here in 1912. It was originally on the riverfront around Esteban in the river, and it was originally part of the slaughterhouse complex when it opened up. in the 1870s. We'll talk about that. Just talk about the Roy family a little bit. William F. Roy was the founder of the St. Bernard Voice and the grandfather of the present of E.M. and Maisie. He was the son of Frederick Roy, who owned an early plantation where the sugar refinery is now, which was used as a brickyard, and he was also the brother of Sebastian Roy. This is a picture of him from when he served in the state legislature. And then this is his son, Edwin Main Roy, who was the editor of The Voice for many years. And then these are his children, the current editor of The Voice, E.M. Roy Jr., and his sister, Maisie Roy Duty. I'll speak a little bit about how some of the streets in the neighborhood were named and how the slaughterhouse came to be. A lot of the streets, Mealy, the other streets going downriver, Mealy, Esteban, Aycock, Hernandez, were named after people connected with the slaughterhouse. William Mealy was a commission merchant. The commission merchants were dealt in livestock futures and all the cattle that were going through the slaughterhouse, and that's pretty much what he was. He didn't actually live in the neighborhood. A lot of these people lived in uptown New Orleans on St. Charles Avenue, but they named the street, the street after him. This is an early view of Mealy Street. This is like the corner of Mealy and Mealy and Charters, where the Reichert House was built later on. These are some old houses. I think this house is still there. So this would have been like the 500 block of Mealy on the uptown side from around 1900, with a canal and some sort of a tramway being in the middle of Mealy, like a narrow gauge railroad for hauling products from the slaughterhouse back to the rendering plant, which was in the rear. This is an early plantation which predated the site of the slaughterhouse in Friscoville. It belonged to a guy named Lucian Hilligsburg. It was used as a brickyard. A lot of the early plantations were used as brickyards. The bricks that were made there were used in a lot of local landmarks. They were used quite extensively in the French Quarter. They were also used to build St. Maurice Church. I think 7 brickyards, the legend is, donated the bricks to build St. Maurice Church. They were also used to build the old Holy Angels Academy on North Rampart Street, with some of those bricks actually being used as paid as tuition during the Civil War, when money was pretty much worthless. One of the early industries in the neighborhood, though, was the stockyard. And the stockyard really developed pretty interesting. All of Old Arabi pretty much came about originally as a workers' town to support the stockyard and the slaughterhouse. The plantation, you can see the names of some of the owners. This plantation, which goes real deep beyond Bayou Avenue, is where the stockyard was built. They owned all of this land. It would have been like from the middle of present-day Mealy through over, going downriver all the way down to Hernandez Street, and then back beyond, beyond on the Gentilly side of Bayou Avenue. This plantation was owned in the mid-1800s by Jules Delry, who owned a plantation also on what's today Delry Street and was a local person. Then it was sold to Charles Cavarock, who lived in what we today call Cavarock House at the sugar refinery. And he sold it to in 1869, the Louisiana legislature granted a monopoly to an entity called the Crescent City Livestock Landing and Slaughterhouse Company. And one of the shareholders was the governor, who was a carpetbagger, Reconstruction governor. And so they gave this entity a monopoly on all cattle and livestock slaughtered in Orleans, Jefferson, and St. Bernard. And which was a tremendous monopoly. Some of the local butchers, and they originally opened at Algiers Point. Some of the butchers that did not fit into this monopoly, though, were very much opposed to this, and they formed their own co-op organization called the Livestock Dealers and Butchers Association. And they bought this property originally from Charles Cavarock. Their president was Paul Esteban. Esteban Street is named after him. And they were going to open they actually began construction, and they were going to open their stockyards and slaughterhouse there But they were basically, then there basically ensued a lawsuit between the two stockyards. And eventually what happened was the lawsuit, after a few years, went before the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was a very famous landmark case dealing with a states' rights type issue. And basically the Crescent City slaughterhouse won, which was the one that the carpetbaggers had backed, and the local co-op lost. And so basically the local co-op of butchers had to sell to Crescent City, and Paul Esteban became the president of Crescent City after that. And a lot of the local people, like Paul Esteban and the butchers that were involved in the early days of the slaughterhouse, were an ethnic group of people which is called Gascon, G-A-S-C-O-N. They were originally natives of the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain. And when they came to Louisiana, their area of expertise was raising livestock and butchering and slaughtering livestock. So they, early on, a lot of the old French families that made up Old Arabi and that worked in the slaughterhouse were of that ethnic background. Then eventually what happened was, you can see this is the area of Esteban and the river where the building, which is now the Voice, was originally located. This levee was moved back in 1912, and so a lot of this was taken in. But these are some of the old buildings of the slaughterhouse. This broken line here going all the way to the back would have been called, what some people call the Stink Canal or the Blood Canal. This is remnants of this canal which still runs along Aycock Street between Royal Street and St. Claude. And this whole area, like I had said, was part of Orleans Parish at that time, but in 1874, because of, I guess, some political maneuvering and because the city of New Orleans passed some ordinances stating that they didn't want slaughterhouses within city limits, the legislature moved the boundary line from where it was Fisherman's Canal somewhere in this area all the way over to what was then the eastern boundary line of Jackson Barracks, where it is today. And then down through the years, Crescent City Livestock Landing and Slaughterhouse Company, I'll show you some other pictures, eventually became Crescent City Livestock Company, Crescent City Slaughterhouse. This is an early building contract from the 1870s when they built the facility. You can see, I think, what the total of all the building contracts was here, and it's not, I can't read it from here, but it's a pretty small sum. I think it's less than $100,000. What eventually happened was the Crescent City entities eventually became, in the early 1900s, became two different entities, New Orleans Stockyards and, see, here's an early lithograph of the Stockyards. And then here is a lithograph, a drawing, I guess, from about 1906. This building, you might recognize, looks remarkably like the Voice building. This is Esteban and the river. This is probably the same building, which is now the St. Bernard Voice, being moved from there in 1912 when they moved the levee back. But this is the cattle chute, which went over North Peters around Aycock Street. This is Aycock Street on the side right here. This photograph was taken in the 1920s. They would unload a lot of the cattle in barges, and they would come into the pens here, and then they would be slaughtered. And then some of them came in by train later on when they had to put the railroad tracks in. It went down Aycock. These are just some early pictures. Well, what had originally happened was these are pictures of a 4-H show that was held from like the late 40s through 1974. This is a photograph of the rendering plant, which was at the end of the back end near Florida Avenue of Angela. It was owned by the Reichert family. I think the Patton family was involved in it for a while, and this is where all of the offal and the bones and everything else from the slaughterhouse were processed into useful products. This is a truck from when the Reicherts had that. This is an interesting shot. This is one of the entities. This is from 1931. These are the employees of the Arabi Packing Company. A lot of local people in this shot, in this photograph, with I guess the executives being back here and the rest of the folks being here, and a couple of pet dogs and so forth in front. This was, so the Crescent City broke into two entities which were, I guess, owned by the same parent, one called Arabi Packing Company and one called New Orleans Stockyards Incorporated, which eventually went in. This is the the first bank of St. Bernard Parish, St. Bernard Bank and Trust, which was at at Esteban in the River, which was founded in 1905 by Joseph Momus. That building was later incorporated into this building. See, that building was here on the corner, which was New Orleans Stockyards Incorporated office. This I'll talk about later. This was the original Arabi post office. And this company eventually became Hodges Stockyards, which closed, I guess, in the early 1960s. And then this building, unfortunately, deteriorated, and in the early 1980s it burned. And this is the fire. And of course, the walls were left standing for a couple years, the solid concrete walls, but they were judged to be unstable, structurally unstable, so they were demolished. I'm going to talk a little bit about the naming of Arabi. This is the person that Arabi was named after. Arabi was actually named after a person called Pasha Arabi. Pasha Arabi was actually, his nationality was Turkish, but in the summer, in August of 1882, he attempted to start a civil war in Egypt, or a revolution in Egypt against the British. What had happened was the French had built the Suez Canal. The British had taken it from them. And the British were ruling Egypt through a puppet local ruler, an Egyptian ruler, and occupying Egypt. And he basically sought to have a revolution to free Egypt from the British. And it didn't last very long. He occupied Alexandria in August of 1882, and he was there for about 3 weeks. There was a lot of local press in the Picayune on it. You can see his name here is mentioned in the headlines. And by the middle of September of 1882, he was subdued, he was defeated, and he was exiled to Ceylon, which is today, Sri Lanka, off the coast of India, for the rest of his life, and he was paraded around basically like a trophy and a prisoner of war. Well, it's kind of an interesting story, but why did they name Arabi after him? Well, during that same period of time, in August of 1882, the local politicians and business leaders had long wanted a post office to serve the slaughterhouse company town. And they were tired of having to go to the nearest post office a couple miles away in New Orleans. So they petitioned the appropriate people in Washington, D.C. to establish a post office. And finally, a post office was established on August 25th, 1882. The town was previously called Stock Landing, and with the boundary line being moved over a couple years ago and the town developing into more of a town, they sought for a unique name to name the post office after. And when I say they, I mean specifically a guy named John Taft, who was like an ancestor of Mr. Taft, who has the Hoghead Cheese place today. He was the president of the police jury at the time. He was also an employee of Crescent City. And A.J. Padron, who had the newspaper, they installed A.J. Padron as the first Arabi postmaster on August 25th, 1882. By legend, the two of them got together and decided that this would be a fitting name because as Arabi was seeking, it contained very much symbolism, as Arabi was seeking independence from Egypt, from the British, they were seeking independence from New Orleans. And most of the people, the ethnic groups that were living in Arabi at the time, were anti-British. They were Gascon, they were Irish, some were German, and they were pretty much anti-British. And so the name stuck, and the name was popular, even though Arabi Pasha was out of the picture after 3 weeks later. Moving a little bit further east on Hernandez Street, this is the old jail, which is today fixed up and used by the Lions Club. It's called the First Ward Justice Courthouse and Jail. It was really a justice of the peace constable jail, and it was built on some property that was acquired from Crescent City Slaughterhouse in 1911. The person who designed it was Henry D'Aberval, who worked for the slaughterhouse. It's interesting because Henry D'Aberval was Angela's son, and it was built by J.C. Berg, who was a local contractor in the neighborhood. And it was used for a couple years. I think the Justice of the Peace stopped holding court there in the mid-20s, It stopped functioning as a jail in '39, so it didn't function as a jail in a justice of the peace court very long, but for the time period that it was open, it was very necessary because the courthouse was at St. Bernard Village, where Beauregard School is now, and it was a long ways away. And so it was very functional for the neighborhood at the time and the people in the First Ward. Right on the corner of Hernandez and Pontalba, next to adjacent to the old jail, was this building here. This building was an early schoolhouse. It was commonly called the First Ward School. I think it was technically called the Nunez School, after a local school board member. And one of the main teachers that taught there for a long time was the daughter of John Taft. It was a lady named Annie Taft. And she taught there for a very long time. In the late 1920s, this was replaced by Momus School over in Friscoville, which later became Arabi School. This building was demolished, and according to legend, the materials from it were used to build a gym over on Community Street, which today we call Spar Gym. They liked to reuse all those materials whenever they could, because I guess they were high-quality materials. I'm going to speak a little bit about, going a little further down now, speak about LeBeau House and the plantation that was associated with it. This is an early shot of LeBeau House when it was owned by Friscoville Realty and called the Friscoville Hotel. LeBeau House was built by a person named Francois Bartholomew LeBeau. It was built, I guess, as a dream house for his wife, Sylvanie Fuselier. His wife was originally a native of Opelousas, and Mr. LeBeau was a real prominent businessman in the New Orleans area. He was the president of the Pontchartrain Railroad, which was the original railroad that ran on Elysian Fields, which was later to Milneburg, which was later called the Smoky Mary. And he died in 1854, so he didn't get to live in the house very long and enjoy it, but his wife and his children and his family lived in the house probably for the next 30 years or 40 years or so. This is a shot of it that was done in '79 of drawing as part of the St. Bernard Bicentennial portfolio. This is a shot which is probably from the 1960s or a little earlier. LeBeau House was then sold. LeBeau House was we've talked a lot about it. Michelle Buck has talked a lot about it. But LeBeau House is pretty unique because it is it's a Creole design of a plantation with an American floor plan. It is a brick between post construction. Both downstairs and upstairs are bricks with the crisscross posts going through it. It's covered with cypress weatherboard, and it has a central hall down the middle. It's very unique. It passed from the LeBeau family in 1905. These are some more recent shots of it with the renovation that's currently going on. And it was the site of the St. Maurice Church Fair. This is the program from it from 1912, where the area was originally called Friscoville Park when Friscoville Realty Company had it. Friscoville Realty Company laid out Friscoville Avenue in 1905 and 1906, and of course they owned this house at first. And they built a lot of, the name Friscoville was from the Frisco Railroad, which was in the area, which was building in the area with Chalmette Slip. And I guess they assumed that, they were speculating that a lot of employees of the Frisco Railroad would be living in the neighborhood, so they thought it would be a good name. When I say they, I mean specifically A.P. Perrin, who was originally a commission merchant cattleman, and his partner, who was probably the principal, more so than what he was, Oliver S. Liverday, who was a local attorney, whose father was a judge in Plaquemines Parish, who is the ancestor of all the Liverday, a good bit of the Liverday family today. Talking a little, so they built many large houses on Friscoville, and it was the silk stocking district. They started around 1906, and they, moving forward through the 20s and the 30s, a lot of very nice homes were built there. It's kind of interesting, though, because there were some homes that were built in the 400 block which came from other places. They were moved there, or they were built out of remnants of plantation houses or outbuildings that were there. A good bit of the 400 block, and particularly the house on the corner of Bienvenue and Friscoville, had like dormer windows from the McCarthy Plantation, which is where the Chalmette Slip is now. I'll talk about it in a little while. This is a shot from 1912 of Friscoville when it was just beginning to develop, with Oliver Liveday's first house being over here, with this house is on the corner of Bienvenue and Friscoville, the Ditmar House, which I think is now owned by the Elyers family, which is the same family. And then something interesting came in with Friscoville, the gambling houses. One of the first gambling houses that was built, which is where the VFW Hall is today, was the Jai Alai, which is actually spelled, Jai Alai is a Cuban sport, which is spelled J-A-I-A-L-I, or A-I. The game Jai Alai, which is a game with a ball with a net and rackets, was played here for a little while, and then it was eventually converted into a gambling house which was owned by Joe Brown. There were many other gambling houses on Friscoville. The second Arabi post office was built on Friscoville, and then all of the gambling houses that still remained were closed in the early 1950s by Senator Kefauver, U.S. Senator Kefauver. Moving on further east, we had the Ford Motor Company, which the building still exists today. It was built in the early 1920s to be used as a manufacturing plant primarily for trucks, which would be shipped to South and Central America. There were some problems with building a wharf in front of it because the docking facilities could never really be built for whatever reason. It didn't survive as a manufacturing plant. It was a parts plant for a parts warehouse for a long, long time and closed. Ford ceased its operations there, I guess, in the 60s, and it was used as many other things since then. It's currently used today, privately owned and used today as a warehouse. Just below that, between the sugar refinery, which is this big building you can see here, and the Ford plant, was another old plantation which was owned by Illinois Railroad and was torn down in the 1940s. The Couvillon family had lived there as caretakers for a good while for the railroad, and the railroad allowed them to take the remnants of the house and move it over to the 400 block of Friscoville, where they rebuilt it into a very nice home, which is still there today. We'll speak a little bit about some of these other plantations which evolved into the sugar refinery. Excuse me. This house was until 1983 the office of the sugar refinery. This is an old picture from about 1906. It's commonly called today Cavaroc House, C-A-V-A-R-O-C. It was originally built for a guy named Pierre d'Arcantel. It was to be used as a brickyard, and the architect is said to have been James Dakin. That's the person that designed the old state capitol in Baton Rouge. This is pretty much what the house looks like today. In 1983, the sugar refinery built a brick building next door to it and ceased to use this as an office. It was rumored that over the Memorial Day weekend in 1983, the house was going to be demolished, similar to what the sugar refinery had done in the 1960s to another plantation called Three Oaks. So the parish officials acted, and the legal actions were taken to prevent that, and the house is still there today, but the house is vacant, to the best of my understanding. This is the old Roy homestead. Remember, I had told you that Frederick Roy was the father of Sebastian Roy and William F. Roy with the newspaper. Well, Frederick Roy moved to the area in the 1830s. He bought this old house, which had been there since before the Battle of New Orleans. It was the home of the Deslon family, of the widow of George Deslon for a long time. It was used as a brickyard. It was called Maison Jalousie, or Jalouses, because of these blinds upstairs. And he left the blinds, and he renovated the house. Well, he operated as a brickyard very successfully, probably from the 1830s through like 1904, when he sold it to the sugar refinery, and they demolished it. It was somewhere in the vicinity of where their main white sugar storage room is now. This is Three Oaks Plantation, which was just a little ways below that. It was built in 1831 or so by a guy named Sylvain Perrault. It was built on the site of an earlier plantation where famous New Orleans litigant Myra Clark Gaines grew up, where she was raised as a child. The plantation house was Went through various owners, and it was sold in 1904 to the sugar refinery. I'll show you a later picture of it, which is quite nice, I guess from the 1930s. It was a real showplace, and it was used by them, I guess, as a guest house and a place to hold company functions and executive functions. But it was demolished in the 1960s. These are some old photographs, some of which go back to 1905 from when the sugar refinery was originally built. This is an old postcard showing some of the other houses, the Cavarock House and some of the other private houses which were along the river, just upriver from the sugar refinery. This is an old shot of the sugar refinery from about 1917. This is the upriver side of it, which is today Old Arabi, and you can see all the different various pieces of land. An arpent is so wide. The old St. Bernard Cypress Company back here, which is somewhere, I guess, around where St. Claude Heights is today. This is a scene of the sugar refinery, of the docking facilities from around that period of time. The sugar refinery for a very long time touted the fact that they were the largest of their kind in the world, that particular plant. This is a shot of it, an aerial from like the 1940s, where you can see all of these houses. This is Community Street, this is Spar Gym. These houses all being built, a lot of them is rental property on Community Street by Mr. Desbin in the 1940s, with Center Street not yet being put in. There's another postcard of the sugar refinery. These are some executives of the sugar refinery, probably from the very early days, in front of Cavarock House. This is a function, I guess a luncheon that was being given at Three Oaks, probably in the 30s or 40s. These are some other scenes of employees going to work, by train, loading sugar, sugar ready for the train to be transported, an early rail car, some sort of a dock loading facility just upriver from or on the upriver edge of the sugar refinery. This says Brooklyn Cooperage, which was, I think, a related company or adjacent company to the sugar refinery. I think these are employees going to work. My only guess is that maybe this was from some strike type period of time, because why would you transport people to work like that? But it's an interesting picture. Same here, they're being towed in the back, carted in the back of a freight truck. The employees' cafeteria. Some of the, I guess, machinery inside of the sugar refinery, and some of the construction processes when they were first building it. The early docks of the sugar refinery. A fire that took place at the sugar refinery, I think about 1952 or in the early 50s. And some more shots of that fire. Some more shots of that fire. Then we have, just below the sugar refinery, we had the McCarthy Plantation, which was used as Andrew Jackson's headquarters in the Battle of New Orleans. The dormer windows from the McCarthy Plantation reputedly have been used to build the house which is today at the corner of Friscoville and B Avenue, which was recently restored by Mr. Demetrius. That whole grouping of houses along there were probably old houses which were moved from plantation houses and reconstructed. This particular house was used as Jackson's headquarters. In 1908, it was demolished, and the New Orleans Terminal Company moved in, which was a subsidiary of the Southern Railway. They built the Chalmette Slip, which is there today, which is now owned by or run by the St. Bernard Port Harbor and Terminal District. But for a long time, it was owned by the New Orleans Terminal Company, which incidentally was a real large property owner at one time in Chalmette. They probably owned all the land from the Guichard Canal all the way over to Versailles. So they owned most of what is today Chalmette west of Paris Road. And they sold that off over time, and then eventually this went to the St. Bernard Port Harbor and Terminal District to have it today. That is pretty much all that I have as far as my outline. The houses in the neighborhood on those streets that I had mentioned were built, a lot of them were built in the, as we can see in the photographs, A lot of them were built in the 1890s and in the period after that. I have some other shots here too I wanted to show you, things to remember. This is the what people later called the frost top, which was at Aycock in St. Claude. It's from a lighter, a photograph of a lighter. These are some camps which were in the Batcher. I think this picture's from about 1941 at Angela and Mealy in the river. This is the dedication of the fire station that used to be on St. Claude between Mealy and Aycock, which was dedicated, I think, by Sheriff Celestine F. Rowley, probably about 1952 or 53. This is Dutch Rowley, Celestine F. Rowley, taken on Friscoville. He passed away in 1953, so this would have been taken before that, and you could see Edward Hebert and Russell Long were the two candidates that he was supporting at that time. This is a shot of the neighborhood that the Port Harbor and Terminal District came out with a master plan like about 1983 when the World's Fair was in New Orleans to possibly dock the idea of docking a cruise ship in the neighborhood, which never really materialized, but shortly after that period of time, with a lot of people doing renovations to old houses in the neighborhood, with the establishment of the Old Arabi Neighborhood Association recently within the past couple years ago, just doing wonderful things to redevelop the neighborhood and encourage local interest in it, from showcasing houses through the annual tour of homes to fixing up people's houses as a result of that can't afford to fix their houses up. The Christmas lights display on the riverfront, just the beautification project on St. Claude. And another thing which has happened to the Old Arabi neighborhood fairly recently is the development of Terry Drive, Arabi Garden subdivision, which are really brick veneer ranch-style houses, large houses, but they have helped establish or helped maintain the property values in parts of the neighborhood, as well as bringing some young people or some newer people into the neighborhood and just sort of, with the Old Arabi Association, galvanizing everything and really pushing the neighborhood forward. And I think what we see now is some very nice, very positive things going on in the neighborhood that we have not seen in a very long time, and hopefully a very, very bright, very encouraging future. So that's pretty much the overview I wanted to present to you tonight. Thank you.
Let's give Mr. Fatcher another hand. We have the house lights, please. On behalf of the Nunez History Lecture Series, I wanted to present this plaque. We'll get that, and have one more hand for Mr. Fatcher. And he will be available at the question and answer period. But what I'd like to do, just to wrap things up for the main part of the lecture, I needed to relate just one story that I'd heard in the build-up to this lecture by Joan Phillips. And I did not grow up here, but my wife, Lonnie, whose better claim to fame is the mother of the mascot, but she talked about growing up, and when she was little, when other kids would be mean to her, she'd get pushed in the canal every once in a while. That seemed to be a rite of passage for kids. And so when I heard the story about Miss Phillips growing up and talking about the blood canal that was mentioned earlier, that she describes as literally a canal full of blood. I'm sure there's some water in it too, but I guess not. And I can just imagine as a kid, what would you be like if you got pushed into the actual blood canal? So it's just very interesting to hear the stories of not so long ago, but of a world that was very different than the world I grew up in or the world that children today grow up in. So it's really valuable to have this knowledge, and I'm glad we'll be able to preserve this heritage. I'd also like to give a great deal of credit to you that we could have 150 people show up in the face of an impending hurricane. That's just a great credit to the St. Bernard community, so I wanted to give y'all a hand as well. And our next lecture, as usual, is scheduled the first Monday of the month. It's at 7 o'clock, and all of you can attest to the wine and cheese reception, how good it was. That's scheduled for 6:30 as well. And it's free and open to the public, and we hope that each of you will bring many more people next time. And so just thanks for coming. We appreciate it. Yeah. Unfortunately, Ms. Buck, due to ill health, cannot be here tonight. So I'm going to do my best to give an update on the restoration process of the LeBeau Mansion. So if I say anything wrong, feel free to correct me from the audience. We'll see what happens. All right. So, and as you know, the LeBeau House has been going since February of 2003. Sal Gutierrez, who was kind of in charge of the restoration process, had worked with Robert Cangelosi, who's a historical architect, to do a restoration of the LeBeau House. All right, and just once again to put forth the idea that Mr. Cangelosi had used the term House of Cards and said that disaster was imminent and that immediate stabilization needed to be done before even a restoration could take place. And he called it structurally significant and salvageable, but time was of the essence. So you can see some of the wear and tear that had happened. Ms. Buck and I were fortunate enough to take a tour of the house during the stabilization, which I have to tell you, it's fascinating to see all what happened. This was my favorite picture. You can imagine that a house that had been left unattended that long would have the usual things that happen, but this is one of the posts, one of the columns. And as you can see, it's just been absolutely hollowed out by termites. One of the main things that had happened was underneath the house were pools of standing water, and it was just an absolute breeding ground for termites. And so a large quantity of sand, more than 500 yards of sand, had to be pumped in underneath just to get all that dried up. All right. And just a few of those, but yeah, that really, I think, more than anything, that picture tells the story. All right, and so stabilization begun. One of the big things that had happened, I think back in 1991, Mr. Mirov, who of course owned the house, had redone the roof in this, if you can see at the very top, the heavy red slate tiles. And I think those are slate or whatever, the red tiles, not only did they not fit into the historical framework, but they were much too heavy. So one of the first things that the architect said is you need to get rid of those or they're putting too much pressure on things. And so a temporary roof was put on. And it's not historically accurate, but one will, just temporarily, one will be put on when the time comes, a more historical roof. All right. All right, and the price tag for just the stabilization, which we'll see a few more pictures, is coming in about $500,000. All right, so it's quite I can attest to looking at it, all the stuff that had to be done for it. All right, so these are just some of the things to shore up everything, to make sure nothing fell down. This is the back of the house. All right, so there is a great deal of attention being paid to the historical aspect of it. Anything that could be salvaged was. So these are just a few examples of the tiles that were original from 1854, of the original roof tiles, and anything like the doors, any element, even if it's taken out to stabilize it, as much is saved as possible. The work is being done by Buddy Turnage of B&K Contractors. This was one of the signature aspects of the house, I think, is the cupola. And apparently at one time there was a spiral staircase up there. But as you can see, that this is a picture of inside the cupola, and there's just that one ladder, one fairly steep ladder. So I went up there, and it has a very good view still. Of course, that didn't go away. All right. So the idea is that sometime, in fact, the last lecture that we had that Ms. Buck gave on the LeBeau House, maybe some of you went to, the idea was put in place to have a LeBeau Citizens Advisory Committee. I don't know if I understand all the inner workings, but the LeBeau House is not part of the foundation, but it's part of the estate. All right, so what we hear, the update is that the LeBeau Citizens Advisory Committee will meet fairly soon, and we'll start trying to figure out potential uses of the LeBeau House. Sal Gutierrez, who's kind of leading the restoration process, has organized this committee so the community could give input on maybe what should be done if and when the resources and everything are there to renovate the LeBeau Mansion. This www.historylectureseries.com, that is, hopefully everybody can figure out that's the website for this. And so any updates on the LeBeau Mansion or the History Lecture Series, you can go there and you can get the updates there. There is a pretty extensive number of pictures on the LeBeau Mansion, both historical pictures from various eras, as well as some of the pictures that you see here for the restoration process.